Welcome, everyone. Today is August 14th, 2019. I'm Dr. Terry Hildebrandt. I'm the Director of Evidence-Based Coaching at the Fielding Graduate University. And today we're doing an Evidence-Based Coaching Thought Leaders webinar. And I'm very excited and pleased to have Dr. Jacqueline Bashara. She's one of our PhD graduates from Fielding. And she's going to be talking about understanding developmental readiness for coaching and sharing insights from key stakeholders in a coaching engagement. And I'd just like to say a little bit about Dr. Bashara. Dr. Jackie is committed to helping individuals, teams, and groups transform their thinking and behavior for greater results and satisfaction. Jackie is an evidence-based, results-oriented leadership coach specializing in neuro-leadership, mindset transformation, professional presence, group and team dynamics, and managing across differences for greater inclusion. As a scholar practitioner, she relies on well-researched and validated theories, models, and concepts to develop practical and powerful strategic interventions to help her clients achieve their ultimate vision. So, welcome, Dr. Bashara. We're excited to have you here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you at this point. And we will be having a conversation at the beginning, and everyone will be able to ask questions and join in that dialogue soon. So feel free to also to use the chat room if you have any comments along the way for our live audience. So Dr. Bashara, let's hear a little bit from you about this concept of developmental readiness for coaching.
So thank you for having me here. I am so excited. The one thing you did not mention, Terry, and I have to say this, I'm also a graduate of the evidence-based coaching program at Fielding.
Wonderful.
Yes, in addition to the doctoral program. When I was in the doctoral program and I was trying to decide what to do my research on, I was having conversations with some of the faculty about coaching, because that was an area I was really interested in. And I was talking about initiatives that I had done earlier in my life, learning and development initiatives, and that there was always this talk of readiness. And so I was curious about how did that play out in an organizational setting? Because when we had talked about readiness, it was in my personal life and how I wanted to grow personally. So as I started researching readiness, I love what one of the people that I was reading, and I can't remember who it was that said this, that said, readiness is the holy grail of coaching right now. And that not a whole lot is known about it, and yet the research on change shows that readiness is a key component of an effective change effort. So I thought it was interesting that there was no universally agreed upon framework for assessing readiness. And I looked at coaching, I called it executive coaching, but because there's no one word that everybody uses for what coaching is in organizations. Some people call it business coaching, some people call it leadership coaching, some people call it executive coaching. So I decided to use one of the earlier terms, which was executive coaching. In my research, I talk about developmental readiness rather than just readiness for coaching. And I want to clarify what that means so that people understand. I set an alarm so I wouldn't miss this call, and now it just went off. Sorry about that. The difference between readiness for coaching and developmental readiness, as I address it in my dissertation, is readiness can be transactional as well as transformational. But coaching at its core is both learning and development. And so I liked a definition that I found in the literature that defined developmental readiness as both the ability and the motivation to not just learn, but to take that learning and internalize it into one's long-term memory. And so in this call, we'll probably identify it as readiness because that's the more popular term. But in the dissertation, I wanted to distinguish that this wasn't just transactional change, but really the development that happens in a coaching engagement.
So I'm really curious about that. Can I ask a question at this point?
Absolutely, that's why I was pausing.
Okay, great. So when you talk about developmental approaches in coaching, how would you distinguish developmental from transactional coaching?
So I want to do a screen share because I developed this little chart in my dissertation to define developmental readiness. So it's ability, can you see it, Terry?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, so it's ability plus motivation, and ability includes the mental capacity, the self-awareness, and the energy for change. And then motivation includes the reasons or interests for the change. And I came up with this. First, I took the definition that was in the literature, and then I adapted it after doing the research that I did. I wanted to talk to the three key stakeholders in an organizational coaching engagement, which is organizations, coaches, and people who had been coached. Interestingly enough, it was almost impossible to get organizations because I asked dozens of organizations and they all said the same thing, which is we don't measure readiness. We don't even ask the question. And so I thought, well, isn't that interesting? So I adapted this definition of developmental readiness after I got the interviews from the coaches and people who've been coached.
Okay, great. So what did you find was the most important stakeholder, or how did these various stakeholders show up regarding readiness?
So it was really interesting, and I am going to I'm going to do another screen share because it's easier sometimes to be able to see it as well as to be able to hear.
Okay.
So on the individual level, factors that indicated readiness was, one, there had to be a desire for change. And desire for change could show up in different ways. One, there could be frustration with the status quo, unhappiness in the current situation or current state of how someone is showing up within the organization, or a desire for relief from the effects of a current situation. The other element that came up in the interviews with the coaches and with the coachees were, and these were people who had completed, I should share this, the coachees that were interviewed had to meet a certain criteria of achieving certain goals, being a part of coaching for a certain period of time. And so I wanted to look at what was it that motivated and engaged people to stay engaged in a coaching process. So another indication of developmental readiness is a goal with an intrinsic value. Almost across the board, people said when the leader identified the goal or somebody outside of them identified the goal, it was not nearly as motivating as something that meant something personal to the person being coached. So intrinsically important goals were important. Both the ability and the permission to identify goals. So sometimes in a coaching relationship, people would say, well, what if there's a goal I want to work on that maybe my boss doesn't agree with or doesn't sign off on? And so when we talk about the confidentiality, it's that you, as the person being coached, get to define and identify the goal that you work on. So it's both the ability and the permission to identify goals. Accountability for goal achievement. That really spoke to indications with intrinsic value. Having a learning orientation. And the ways that a learning orientation might show up in an individual would be someone who exhibits curiosity. Maybe they're asking questions, or maybe they are reflecting on self or on certain situations within the organization, rather than always being externally focused. An openness to self-discovery and self-disclosure. Another is being aware of individual limitations. So it's not on one end of being so grand that they can do it all, or where they deflect any bit of ownership, but somewhere in the middle where they're able to see the individual limitations and being proactive in engaging with learning activities. And then the last thing that, again, it was interesting that I expected the self-awareness answer that was next from coaches. I didn't necessarily expect that answer from people who had been coached, but across the board, they identified self-awareness as an important indication of readiness. And self-awareness, as it was described in the interviews, was knowledge of both strengths and challenges, not just one or the other. A willingness and an ability to self-disclose, and honesty with both self and with the coach. And so sometimes how it would show itself in the interviews is that when the person was outside of the coaching conversation, something would show itself and the person would say, oh, wow, that's what we were talking about in the coaching conversation, or this is what the coach was trying to help me to see, or this was part of the feedback that I received. So honesty both with self and then bringing it into the coaching conversation. Another thing I want to get to really quickly is, in addition to the individual level factors, I also looked at organizational factors. And what I was looking at with organizational factors is, if you are being coached, and let's say in your coaching, you're trying to develop a stronger presence or a stronger sense of self and leadership, the leadership skill set of being more proactive and engaging, but you're in an organization that doesn't reward that or doesn't honor that, then there can be some issues of conflict that come up. And so one of the things that we talked about in the interviews was the organizational level factors. And so one is an organization where there's a learning culture. And a learning culture was described as being able to explore without punishing mistakes. So you can take a risk, you can try something differently than had been done before. And if it didn't work out, or if it was a defeat, that the effort was applauded and the mistake wasn't punished. Where there was encouraging of risk-taking, and again, as I spoke about a moment ago, applauding and rewarding effort. Another indication of the organizational level factors were proactive feedback. And how proactive feedback was described by the people I interviewed was that feedback was both consistent and continual. Critical feedback was seen as important, particularly for people who were high achievers, which again matches what's in the research, that high achievers tend to want critical feedback even more than positive feedback. And that feedback should be both formal and informal. So in essence, that there's not just a bridge, but there's a whole highway of information giving you feedback on, one, how you're doing, and two, how it's moving you forward in the organization. And then the last organizational factor that came up in the literature had to do with leader buy-in. Oftentimes organizations will invest in coaching because maybe that's what's seen as the thing people are doing now, but the leader doesn't necessarily buy in. And people said they can tell when the leader doesn't buy in. And so an indication of buy-in is that the leader shows interest and curiosity about the coaching engagement. And not to say that confidentiality gets violated, or they ask about everything you talk about, but how's it going? You know, what are you learning from it? Is there anything you'd like to share? The leader receiving coaching. Oftentimes, and I certainly have this with organizations that I've been asked to come in as a coach, where the leader wants coaching for the staff, but not for him or herself. And so leader buy-in could be seen as the leader also receiving coaching. And the leader being willing to share the coaching experience. This is what I learned from coaching. There's one organization that I began a coaching program in. It's a global manufacturing and production facility. And the COO was someone I had coached, and then he brought me into the organization. And one of the reasons I think it was so successful was he would talk with people who were uncertain about coaching or curious about it, about his own journey with coaching and what it gave him and how it helped him to develop. So those were the organizational factors that came to play. So I'll stop the share and see if you have any questions or what else you would like to explore about readiness.
Excellent. So I'm curious, you talked a lot about organizational readiness, coachee readiness. What about coach readiness?
That is a great question. I didn't actually ask specifically about coach readiness because it really was on the readiness of the client. But what came up, this was probably the most surprising finding, and it's something I want to do a little more research on. Mm-hmm. The people of color that I interviewed, what they said is oftentimes what gets called a lack of readiness is actually a lack of feeling understood. Mm-hmm. And that the coach needs to be aware enough to know, is this a readiness issue, or might there be a cultural competency issue, or an issue around racial differences or differences around ethnicity. So here's for instance, one of the women that I interviewed as someone who'd been coached said that she is a Black woman and in a pretty high position in her organization. And she was paired with a middle-aged white man as a coach. And she said he was a fabulous coach. He had a lot of information. And she said, but, you know, this was a time when there were a lot of shootings of young Black men. And she said, there was such a sadness on my heart. And, you know, he and most of the people in her organization were white as well. And she said, you know, I didn't want to teach everybody about what it's like to be Black in America and be afraid of your sons being out. And so she said, you know, so my lack of engagement could have been seen as a lack of readiness when it wasn't a lack of readiness at all. It was a lack of feeling understood and not wanting to explain again and again and again why I was having trouble. So what that let me know is that as someone who is a coach, it's important for me to understand the various dynamics that might be at play. And we can have a tendency, not all coaches, but we can have a tendency to put the onus on the person who's being coached, mm-hmm. or the potential coachee. Oh, well, they're not ready. They're not being open. They're not being engaging. When, again, if we look at systems theory tells us that, you know, we're both participating in what's working and we're both participating in what isn't. And so I might have to broaden my understanding of what's happening to see, is this a readiness issue or is there something else at play?
Got it. Makes sense. Okay. So we have a question from one of the audience members. Amy, would you like to come online and ask your question?
Yes, sure. Sorry, I had to unmute everything. So with that question, it led me to ask myself, which was, how do then you pair a coach? So for example, some of the coaching that I see going on in my organization appears to be a little random, which is individual needs a coach, we assign them a coach. But what kind of, I guess, pre-questions or what kind of information is needed to ensure that, you know, to your point, you get the right type of coach for the individual who wants coaching?
Great question, Amy. It's interesting. Every single person I talked to for the dissertation, and then even when I was reaching out to organizations, all the coaches said, even though they know the importance of readiness and they believe in readiness, that none of them ever asked the question about readiness. And so most of them said they went by, you know, how it felt in their gut. So there was no real scientific way. It's just, okay, does it click? Does it not? And how does that, you know, what does my gut tell me, essentially? Almost all of them talked about the gut feeling. The conversation that I think is important to have, and this is based both on my dissertation as well as reading I've done during the dissertation process and post-dissertation, is it's really important to find out from the person being coached or wanting a coach, one, what is it they look for? And two, I always ask the question, when you think of yourself at your very best, when you think of yourself at your most effective and your most satisfied, because you can be effective and not be very happy or not feel satisfied. When you think of yourself at your most effective and most satisfied, what does that environment look like? Is it a collaborative engagement? Is it something where you're doing a lot of self-reflection? One of the, he has since passed, but Charlie Seashore used to say, everybody needs blankets and everybody needs sandpaper, they just need them at different times. And so one of the questions that I would ask myself, or I would ask somebody, a potential coachee, is this a time where sandpaper is going to be what's needed, or do you need a blanket right now? So really understanding what is the learning style, what is the current need, and then trying to match that. Most of the engagements where I do coaching, oftentimes the person who is interested in coaching is given 2 or 3 bios and has the opportunity for a half an hour conversation to see, you know, does this match? One gentleman I talked to said he was very serious and he wanted somebody that he could laugh with. And so, you know, he said, all the bios look great. Everybody looks smart. Everybody looks trained, but I want someone who's going to make me laugh. And so we, you know, we had a great coaching relationship out of that. So Amy, I hope that helps. But definitely, in a lot of ways, organizations are not being effective in the way they're approaching coaching. As I said, every single person I talked to, and even people that I, you know, when I wanted to talk with, interview the organization, said, we never ask questions about readiness. It wasn't even a blip. Same thing the coaches said, even though we know readiness is important, some of them said, yeah, I just kind of feel it out to see if they're ready. But again, it's all about a feeling and not, you know, okay, what does it look like? I want to do a screen share because out of the dissertation, I actually developed a model, and this I use, and I'm hoping it will be helpful to show it to you. So the desire for change plus goals identification plus the capacity to fully engage, and that was a huge one. A lot of people talked about it wasn't an issue of not wanting it, but they were just overwhelmed with what they had to do at work or their deadlines, or and some people said, you know, the first time they tried coaching, it didn't work because they just didn't have the energy to give to it. And so desire for change was made up of hope for something different than the current state, motivation to achieve an outcome or to self-develop, and a willingness to take action. Plus goals identification, which is engagement and goal definition and refinement process. I find sometimes when I'm coaching someone, they'll say, well, what do you think my goals should be? And for someone who's really ready for coaching, it's important that the goal identification come from them with support from the coach. There has to be an intrinsic connection to the value of the end result of the engagement and articulation of clearly defined desired outcomes. What came out in the research was that when people could clearly define what they wanted, they really knew they were ready for change. And oftentimes they were offered coaching or they went through a coaching process and they couldn't articulate what they wanted, and it wasn't as effective as it came to be. And then again, the capacity to fully engage was really critical. It's having the cognitive resources to engage in a change process, the temporal space to engage in recursive cycles of reflection and action, and the openness to accept and reflect upon feedback. There's a gentleman that I'm coaching in a government organization, and I asked him, I said, would it be all right if I told you what I'm noticing in our conversations? And he said, okay. And I said, whenever you talk about something you hope will happen, the next thing you say is, but of course that'll never happen. And so one of the, I hate to call it homework assignments, but one of the things to do in between the times we coached was for him to pay attention to when he was talking about a hope he had and how he framed that. So, you know, the openness to hear that, because sometimes it's hard. And he did say it was hard to hear. And at first he said he was defensive, and because he thought I was telling him he was pessimistic. And I said, no, I wasn't defining it, and I wasn't judging it. I was just identifying the phrase that would come after he mentioned a hope that he had.
So, Dr. Jackie, I'm curious, your model that you just shared could be turned into an intake form. I'm just curious if that's been done, or
I am in the process, Terry. Yes, and a couple people have asked me to do that, that they wanted to informally have used it, but that's one of the things I'm working on actually in my postdoctoral work.
Okay, wonderful. We also have a couple of questions here in the chat room from the audience. Okay. So Grace, would you like to come online and ask your question? Can you hear us, Grace? I'm going to unmute you, Grace, just to make sure.
I can also read it.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We do hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jackie, this is, I'm sitting here in Australia thinking, oh wow, this is such great content and so accessible. So even though this is part of your dissertation, you've made it really accessible for us as coaches.
Thank you.
And, you know, and I don't actually have a question except to say that in response to Amy's question about how do you do that, it's about the questions we ask. All right, so I often ask questions when I meet someone for a chemistry check, knowing that they are organizationally sponsored, they are meeting 2 or 3 other coaches. One of the really open questions I tend to ask is, you know, how are you going to decide who your ideal coach is? So that helps them open up to think about who they best work with and who can help them do that, because I don't go in thinking I've got to get this gig, right? And so that helps the client just open up and have a conversation of I work best or I'm looking for, and that helps inform some of the things that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And to your point, Grace, thank you for the comment and your input there. And to your point, I will oftentimes ask, what do you need to know to make the best decision for yourself? Because this really is about you. And sometimes they stop and think about it, and then sometimes they already know. You know, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. And so I think it's important for the coach to be aware and to be armed with the questions that will help to bring that out. So before we assess somebody not being ready, I think the question I always have to ask myself is, have I done everything I can to create the environment for success? And sometimes yes, and sometimes it's a learning. Sometimes I go, oh wow, I wish I'd have thought to do this or that, and that's where I call it doing a self-inventory is important. And I have what I call support and accountability partners, where we support each other around our learnings. And you know, what did you learn from this conversation? Or how did you assess readiness in that conversation?
So this brings up another key point for me around the power of supervision, of having a trusted other that you can do reflection around. Any thoughts on how a coach might use a coach supervisor to support readiness?
Yes, I do. So Terry, do you want to do an experiment with me really quickly?
Sure.
You know, I knew you had to say yes since we're doing this, but so tell me what you see.
I see a hand.
Okay, what
in
else?
front of your face.
Okay, what else? Describe the hand. What do you see in the hand?
Well, it's like pushing away, not
Okay.
welcoming. It's like a no hand.
Okay.
Or like a stop hand.
Okay, and what do you see here?
What's open?
Okay.
Fingers extended.
Okay.
And there's a V in your lifelines, I suppose.
Is that a long lifeline, Terry? I hope so.
Like it.
So you see the palm then, right? And you're able to see the right. So I see a hand as well. And I see an open hand. I see 5 fingers. But what I see are knuckles. And I see fingernails. I can't see the palm. And you can't see the back of the hand. But together, we can get a better sense of the whole. Mm. And so oftentimes I do that with people that we're working to raise the awareness, or if you're looking at the Johari window, to try to close the blind spot a little bit. And so when I'm doing support and accountability, as I call it, I'm oftentimes, if you're a believer in Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENFP. So a lot of, what comes to me is a feeling I get or a sense I get of something. And so I know I can have a tendency to rely too much on that. So part of the feedback that I get is, well, how do you bring the cognitive side in more? And how do you balance those things out? So I think supervision is critically important. I think it is, but I will also say, I think who supervises you is critically important. I think part of what I look for in someone to help me in my growth and development is if I have a well-honed area. So my instinct is very well honed. What I wanted to work on was, how do I access theory and not be directive? And so I asked one of my professors from my master's program if she would mentor me. And so we would have conversations about, well, what are you seeing? What am I seeing? One of the best teachers I ever had about that is, let me see if I can pick up something here. I don't know if you can see, I have like a USB thing. And so I'd say, okay, if I look at it from this angle, what might I see? If I look at a situation through race dynamics, let's say, what might I see? And if I look at it this way, if I look at it from a perspective of resistance, what might I see? If I look at it from this, and so for me, I work visually. So anything that helps me to access a more open state of mind and to move my biases to the side, because we all have them. So I think it's really important, one, for people to help us see the parts of ourselves that we don't easily see or not aware of. And the most important thing that I believe supervisors of coaching can do is to help me get out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We also have a question from Dr. Pierce. Anne, would you like to come online?
Can you hear me?
We do hear you, and we see
Okay.
you.
So I'm listening to this and I'm intrigued because I work across those two dimensions with individuals and organizations. And so my comment was, from what I'm hearing you and what I'm thinking about, is that you're describing, I would think, readiness not so much as a binary choice, you're ready for coaching or you're not ready for coaching, but more of a continuum. And I'm wondering how you're viewing this. In a growth mindset, I might ask, so why is this important for you right now? And what meaning might this hold for you? And I know that I get both dynamics. I get individuals who are highly motivated, but their organization is really dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. But I don't deny them help. And then I've got others where the organization and leadership really sees the benefit of this, but the person is perhaps in such an overwhelmed state at the moment that I wouldn't say they're not ready, but they're at a very low readiness now. So it's a yet. Not quite yet ready to invest at a high level. So the question might be, what types of energy are you at this present time able to invest in that? So I'm wondering your viewpoints of how you're now viewing this now that you've worked on this work.
Yes, excellent. I actually, in the dissertation, I drew a model of where readiness, the different areas readiness can show up. Okay. And so I do think, and so thank you so much for the question, because I want to be clear that it isn't a yes or a no. Yes. Okay. It isn't an either or. What it is, though, is in organizations, and this might be a controversial statement, I'm not sure, but where funds are limited, and let's say you have 5-10 people that you might offer coaching to, but you only have the funds for X amount. So who do you pick? And again, it's not that one is right or not right, but the earlier on that readiness shows itself, the more effective coaching tends to be. Yes. And how we know that, of course, is the way that you engage. So there was one person, he was a vice president of in the global manufacturing and production organization I was talking about earlier. And he and I were having conversations, and I could tell he wasn't really engaged. And so I let it go a little bit just to see, because, we're just getting to know each other. And so we did have a conversation around, is this the right engagement for you right now? Is this fitting? So he took about 3 months off. And then he contacted me and he said, okay, I'm ready to dig in. When he was ready, he was engaging in the activities, the growth, the stretch activities, in the self-disclosure, in practicing the new behaviors that he wanted to take on, internalizing the information. So it wasn't to say that the months that he did it where he wasn't really ready didn't amount to anything, but it is all part of the process. And you talked about growth mindset. So the conceptual framework I used for my dissertation was Carol Dweck's growth versus fixed mindset. Right. And because it's, to Grace's point, it's very accessible. You can take the scholarly words and then growth, fixed, and really be able to talk about it in an organizational setting. And so, you know, you can have readiness at the beginning, but it can also develop as you go on and something clicks. So again, it's not an either or, but like anything, you're bound to get more out of it if you engage fully in the practices and in whatever is the conversation with the coach, and open to self-exploration. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because it can sound like an either or, and it isn't.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I had a question about the organizational side of readiness. Is there a way that we could really help HR leaders and other organizational leaders to prepare better for coaching?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
What advice would you give them if they're going to launch a significant coaching program, maybe with high potentials? What advice would you tell HR to really get the most out of this?
So how do we define coaching? What is it that we're doing? Because what I find is, and there's one organization in particular that they bring us into coach, and I can't tell you how many times, excuse me, the HR person says, you know, we've talked to them, they know what coaching is, and then I sit down with the person and the person says, so what goals should I be working on? And so where it's more like a training. And they think of it as a training. Well, I thought you were going to teach me to be a better leader. And, you know, so what is it you're going to teach me? So an understanding of what coaching is, that it is the person getting coached that drives the engagement. It's not the coach. In a school, possibly, or in a, you know, training where I bring the information, but that's not the coaching relationship. So one, what is coaching? What does it mean to engage in the Socratic method? Because it isn't me bringing the answers as much as how can I ask powerful enough questions to help you get the learning and development that's going to best suit whatever it is you're trying to achieve. I cannot stress enough the importance of assessing readiness, because again, what happens often, and I know this both from my experience and then talking to colleagues, is someone will say, well, you know, they were offering coaching, so I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll give it a try. And, you know, so then of course they don't necessarily, I just had this conversation with someone and I said, so, and that's what she said. She said, you know, I just thought I'd give it a try because they're offering it. And so I said, you know, well, what would you like to work on? Well, nothing really. I mean, I'm a pretty good manager. I do pretty well. So what do you want to tell me about leadership? Or, you know, so again, the readiness and looking at, again, the model that I developed, and people will have their different ways to assess it, is, you know, is there a desire for change? Do they want to move toward something? And is there the willingness and the capacity to engage? And so I think that is critically important. And I also think we have to be aware that people of different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, sexual identity, different age groups, different ability level, we don't all communicate the same way. And so oftentimes we come at it unilaterally. You know, this is what coaching should be. And it might not translate the same for everybody. I'll just give a really quick example. Part of the reason I got into being a coach was I had coaching, and it truly was life-changing for me.
Wow.
I am Lebanese and Syrian. I grew up in West Virginia with a family that spoke Arabic in our household. It was very much a Middle Eastern culture. I was disowned when I was 19 years old because it was the choice between, as I say, the choice between living the life I was raised to live or living the life I was born to live. And And so what I was taught was it's disrespectful if people older than you are in the room and you're sitting, you're supposed to get up and give them your chair. If you're a woman, your role is to be of service, to be subservient. And that's the way I was engaging in the workplace as well. I didn't know to draw a distinction between home life and what's in the organization. And so there were people that entered my path that were able to say, okay, Jackie, without throwing away, you know, these formative lessons, how can you leverage that to get what you want in the organizational setting? And a lot of people translated my behaviors into, well, she's not motivated, you know, because I wasn't, you know, I didn't rush to the front, you know, to the table. And I remember when I was I was doing news in West Virginia, I was doing a broadcast, and I was making some ridiculous amount of money. And the sports guy was making twice the money I was making, working half the hours I was working. I remember thinking, there is something terribly wrong with this. I didn't even know to ask for it. But of course I didn't, because my cultural teaching was that you don't ask for it. And so particularly now that we are more than ever developing into a global economy with people from all over the world, we have technology that's allowing us to have conversations with people all over the world rather easily. And so I think it is critically important to have conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And interestingly enough, every single person I interviewed from the coach, from the side of the coaches, said that none of that was included in their coach training. That they didn't, that was not talked about. I think it's talked about a little more now, but I still don't think enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for maybe one or two more questions. Anyone else would like to come on live and ask Dr. Jackie a question?
How might we access your research?
Well, it's in the Fielding database.
Okay.
And so I think Terry has the name of it in the invite. And I would be honored for anyone who would like to read the research.
Okay.
So, Dr. Jackie, would you be open to having us posted on the community of practice?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so I will do that.
Yes, absolutely.
As well. So when we post the link to this recording, we'll include your dissertation as well.
And actually, I'm honored to say that I was chosen or accepted to write a chapter for the monograph. So I will also be, that will also be showing up there.
Wonderful. Yeah, and for those who don't know, part of our goals with the community of practice is to publish, and Fielding has its own publishing house. So we'll be coming out with the monograph, early next year. So we're really pleased to have you submit a chapter for us. That'll be wonderful. And someone else asked about the models. I assume the models are in your dissertation as well?
Yes, all the illustrations are there, yes.
Okay, great, excellent. So I'm also curious about this, in terms of readiness, when we're trying to choose people for coaching who might be, even applying to be coached in an organization. Do you have any advice for HR and maybe helping be clear about what coaching really is, and helping those potential clients be coming in with eyes wide open, and so they know, maybe even self-select whether they're ready or not?
So one of the things that I think is really important about coaching is that it is hard work. The energy that it takes to look inside, to talk about what's happening, to be willing to look at things from different perspectives. It's not it's not easy. And oftentimes I think people think, well, you know, it's just an hour conversation. But it isn't. That hour conversation is just a rooting, you know, developing the foundation, but the work is happening outside of that conversation. And so one of the things that is very clear in the research is that it is more, a bigger motivator is moving towards something you want to achieve than away from something that you don't want. And so asking questions about what is it that you want? Do you have a goal? Is there something that you would like to be working toward? And so I think that's a very important question, and that HR can really assess. The other thing is that this is not, it's not a teaching time, although I do believe that coaching, an element of it is education. And I will oftentimes, when I'm coaching, I talk about myself as a scholar practitioner. And if I do know research that will help or literature that will help, you know, certainly I bring that into the conversation. But I think HR needs to be clear that that the structure of coaching is that there are a lot of questions to help you get to an answer that's inside of you that you may not be aware of yet. And I think it's really important to assess capacity. That was the biggest differentiator, is, again, people would sometimes want to, they had goals they wanted to achieve, but they just didn't have the capacity to take any more on. So the organization, now this is my belief, the organization has got to work with the person being coached and with the structure of coaching to say, how can we support this as an organization? And so part of what HR needs to be aware of is this isn't just a person being coached. This is an organizational setting, and how can we support that?
Right. Yeah, I have had a coach in one large organization, and I found a lot of the, it's only a 6-session program, but a lot of the folks drop out mainly because they're too busy. And they'll reschedule, and then eventually just kind of say, I just don't have the time for it.
Right.
And I think that is, there's a lot of guilt behind that too. It's like, I wanted to do it and then I couldn't. Do you know what I mean? So I think this whole idea of creating space for coaching and bandwidth for coaching is critical, and maybe a lot of organizations underestimate that.
Well, and yeah, I agree. And I think that's the part of the organizational support, is how might we relieve some of that for the learning and development, which, again, the literature tells us anywhere from, 600 times, 700 times the ROI. So what we're going to invest in it, you're going to get that over and over and over and over. And so it really is in your benefit to try to create some space for that, to allow that, the learning and development of the people in our organization.
Great. Well, Jackie, I really thank you for coming today and sharing your insights and your research and your models. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
we look forward to also reading your dissertation, which we'll post online. And is there a way people can get a hold of you if they have further questions?
Absolutely. I'll put in the chat box my email.
Okay, great. And
because I think everybody can access that. Oh, I have to change this to everyone. So my email is jackie@dynamiccollaborations.com. And please do reach out. I would love to hear from anyone who wants to have a little more conversation. Somebody asked me one time, I'll say this quickly, what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, retire? I'd be having these same conversations. This is what I'd be doing. So I just love these conversations and would welcome anyone that wants to engage further.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I just have a couple of quick announcements for those who are on the line or maybe listening and are not familiar with fielding. This program is part of our community of practice So we have the coaching community of practice, which you can all join for free, and it's open to anyone who has a passion for coaching. You can go to coach.fielding.edu, click on Coaching Community of Practice, and then you can see all the different things that we're engaged with. We have an annual conference, we have continuing coach education, we have twice a month webinars, and we also have a blog and publishing opportunities, and we also offer coach education. We have 2 programs, a year-long ICF accredited evidence-based coaching program, which Dr. Bashar is a graduate of, so thank you for letting us know that. And we also have the 8-month evidence-based coaching for organizational leadership certificate for people who've already had some coach training and would like to get even more and experience the power of coaching. We also will have another webinar coming up in about 2 weeks. So if you go to our evidence-based coaching blog, you can read about that upcoming webinar. And I'm really excited about this one. It is around coaching in pastoral work and faith communities for spiritual development. So if any of you know anyone who works in the area of faith or spiritual development or spiritual direction, we'll have a panel of 3 scholar practitioners that will be talking about their experiences in using coaching in this work. So Dr. Began is a graduate of the doctoral and the EBC program. Jean Marie Mudd is a graduate of the EBC program, and Dr. Adam Robersmith is a prominent pastor and spiritual director as well. So we look forward to hearing from them, and that again will be on Wednesday, August 28th. So join us in a couple weeks for that event as well. And we do post all of our upcoming events here right on the website, so you can see those ongoing events here on our EBC blog, which is just fielding.edu/blog. So we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar, and thanks again, Dr. Bashara, and we look forward to our continuing engagement. So everyone have a great evening. Bye for now.
Thank you.